At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP18. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 2. 37 Wilson to my mother. The witch, where have you gone? Where has the devil taken you? You have died today. I do feel incredible remorse. You were my mother after all, and my heart yearns for you with every passing second. I realize how I have wronged you, my dearest mother. I am currently writing this with quivering hands and my tears drops have splattered all over the ink. I am sitting at my desk. The gray world is eerily quiet, and beside me are your empty clothes. I should be saying that your death is unfortunate. Truly, it was the most fortunate thing that had ever happened to you, was it not? You are free now wherever death or the devil has taken you. May you rest in peace, alongside nature and her deities. I am unable to describe my grief with just pen and paper, but do know this happy thing. I am incredibly excited for this special year you have given me. At first, I was furious that you had ruined my chances of completing my lifelong mission. Do not hold it against me, for finding out that you had passed your powers down to a random boy with the strange name Yuta was quite disheartening. However, as you explained the situation to me in death, I realized something. It is because of the decisions you made that I am special. I am more special than the men before me who upheld this special duty. I am even more special than King William I. That is because I have a choice that none of them were permitted to make. I have the choice to either end the curse forever or continue it for an eternity. And that is what makes it exciting, Mother. I realize that my dream since childhood was not simply fulfilling my tasks and receiving a son. It was to be the greatest man who ever existed. Because of this newfound specialness, I am much greater than all of my father and grandfathers. I am the greatest man alive. I am greater than the devil. I am greater than God. Tell me, Mother, before I end my first journal entry, how shall your name be revealed to me in some time, as you said? You are gone now, and I regret not knowing your true name. Excuse me. Wilson Stevenson looked up from his dusty green journal and locked eyes with a student who approached his desk. Wilson blinked away his tears and forced a friendly smile on his face, after setting aside his quill pen. The boy that stood in front of him was quite different from the rest of his students. It dawned on Wilson that he had never taught or seen this student during his 180 years of teaching. The black-haired boy was as tall as Wilson, only it appeared that he was uncomfortable with his height. Upon further inspection, that boy was uncomfortable with everything about himself, from the way he fumbled with the sleeves of his black sweater to the way he shifted nervously. His windswept locks were matted and dull, and his thin lips were pressed into a resting frown. His skin was so pale it had a waxy appearance, and at first Wilson thought he was dead. His black eyes caught Wilson's attention immediately. They were sullen and cast a downward gaze upon the black rose that rested beside Wilson's arm. They were almond-shaped, and within those wind-stirred orbs, it seemed he was shattered inside. Those eyes that peered at him were wide with helplessness, yet underneath the pool of darkness were unseeable violet hues glinting with fierce power. He looked a lot like the witch, Wilson could not help but realize. "Oh, hello, lad. My name is Mr. Stevenson," he greeted, smiling up at the boy. "Could he be one of my marked? Perhaps, but that damn devil hasn't told me who they are yet." I'm the new transfer student," the boy nervously replied. He reached into his pocket and fumbled within it before pulling out a yellow piece of paper. His hands had a tremor when passing it, but Wilson politely dismissed it as he accepted the paper. "Ah, you're the transfer student, huh?" Wilson remarked as he unfolded the paper. He recalled one of the secretary ladies telling him that a new student was going to be joining his classroom this year. Wilson's eyes scanned the slip and abruptly stopped at his name that was written on it. His emerald eyes widened with shock and his breath hitched in his throat. Wilson blinked rapidly and traveled his eyes across the name again, to make sure this delusion wasn't an effect of the pagan powers. Yuta, it read in light writing. It was true. Right there, in swift handwriting, was his name. That boy wasn't just a boy. That boy was the boy who had been wrongfully gifted the powers of a witch. "Why, your name is Yuta." he asked to confirm, swallowing the lump lodged in his throat. "Yes, sir," the boy replied, swiftly nodding. For a moment shock overwhelmed his senses. Wilson had thought that he would have to go out of his way to find that special pagan boy. Instead, that boy was directly in front of him, twiddling his thumbs nervously inside room 110. What a small world it was, what a coincidence, and what luck he had. It was too good to be true. After he regained his senses, Wilson Stevenson's lips curved into a playful smirk. His eyes darted from the paper to the boy, realizing that this was a good thing. A very good thing indeed. The new witch was in front of him. There would be no need to travel the world to find the boy because he was here. Wilson's legs bounced with giddy excitement as he beamed at Utah. This year was going to unfold with more ease than he had initially thought when his arms were wrapped around his dying mother. "Well, I hope to get to know one another better, Utah," he said, and gave Utah another beaming smile. He watched as the boy observed his smile, to discern his true intentions. So Wilson flashed his grinning teeth, a tactic he learned from humans. It truly swayed anyone into thinking he was the nicest teacher at Willesden. Utah's eyes brightened and he nodded timidly. From that point onward, he put his trust in his teacher. What a foolish thing to do. Wilson Stevenson outstretched his hand and Utah shook it, their palms grazing against each other as their fingers interlocked. "Go ahead and take any free seat. The class will begin shortly." Wilson watched as the boy nodded and shuffled towards a free seat in the middle of the classroom. He exhaled and peered down at his quivering hands, surprised that he was nervous. "It is fine. Everything is perfect. That boy does not know he is a witch," Wilson assured himself, although he knew that he would have to forcibly mark him and swim through his mind to confirm that. During homeroom, Wilson had his eyes on Utah the entire time. Seeing the boy witch in his classroom truly excited him. He watched as he conversed with the grade 11 students of Willesden, and nervously fumbled with himself. He grinned when Utah left the classroom alongside Carter, and the rest of the students shut the door behind them. Wilson Stevenson crossed his arms and smugly leaned against the front of his desk. He stared into the partially dissipated classroom and paused for a moment before contacting the devil. Then he brought his right palm under his lips and whispered an incantation, his hot breath landing upon the mark. "Hello, devil," Wilson said, as a mist of blackness soared through the classroom window. It blended with the shadows of the dim room, but Wilson could identify it because it was the only moving shadow. "Who are my marked students?" The devil sniggered maliciously and swished towards the desk that was in the left corner of the classroom, leaving behind a trail of darkness. Wilson glanced at his seat chart and matched the desk that the devil stopped at to the student who sat there. "Ah, Carter," Wilson confirmed, unable to suppress his excited smirk. Carter was the white-haired boy he had taught since his first year at Willesden. He was quite authoritarian and military-like, so Wilson was eager to discover what form his paranormal activity would take. It was difficult to discern at the moment, but he knew the boy would be feeling an immense amount of disbelief once Wilson started tormenting him. "Jessica," he said as the devil that was in the form of a shadow traveled forward. He stopped at the desk closest to the window on the front aisles. Jessica was the blonde-haired girl he had also taught since her first year of high school. She was best friends with Olivia, everyone knew that. Wilson wondered if perhaps her fear was of Olivia, because of her visible distaste towards her. Regardless, it would be fun swimming through her grim mind, and peer into the thoughts she would be having. "Olivia," Wilson noted, as the devil hovered above the desk beside Jessica's on the right. Olivia was the tan-skinned girl who always looked at her homeroom teacher with googly eyes. She was the #1 most popular girl at school, so it was difficult for Wilson to speculate her fear. Whatever it was, he had a feeling he was going to enjoy tormenting the prissy girl. "Josh," Wilson said, as the devil flew to the desk directly behind Olivia's. Josh was a student he was incredibly interested in. Not only did his shining emerald eyes and brownish hair remind him of his younger self, but his obsession with football could be a potential weak point of his. Wilson jumped at the opportunity to mess with the jock's head and distract him from his goal. "Barbara," Wilson murmured, raising his eyebrow as the devil flew to the desk on the right of Olivia's. Wilson did not know Barbara well enough to theorize potential fears. All he knew was that she was a target of Olivia's squad, and was too shy to stand up for herself. That would make it much easier to torment her for longer because it would be less likely for her to tell someone about it. Ronald, Wilson finished, as he watched the devil fly to the right side of the classroom and hovered over the desk near the door. Ronald was the only dark-skinned boy at Willesden, so from the moment Wilson saw him, he knew he was different from the rest. Surprisingly, he climbed his way to almost the top of the clique hierarchy of Willesden High School, only to be stepped on by Josh. His current rivalry with Josh was an intriguing one because Wilson remembered the prepubescent 14-year-olds on their first day of school, and they were relatively close back then. Wilson scanned the seating chart once more, surprised to realize that some of the marked students he had this year were descendants of the families of the marked students he killed in 1846. The rest had witch hunter blood somewhere within their bloodline, and it didn't seem that far-fetched because Willesden was a feeding ground for witch hunters during the purges. So, Yuta is not one of my 6 marked? He asked the devil, who remained silent throughout. Of course he isn't. He has pagan blood, and the witch specifically wanted to target witch hunters, Wilson told himself, although he was still disheartened over the fact that forcibly marking him was going to be troublesome. The devil snorted as he approached Wilson's desk, and stared at him blankly. That is what you care about? The witch boy. Does it not pain you for 1 second that you will be killing these children whom you have taught for years? I do not care about those children. I have taught them for a mere 2 years out of my 200 years of living. Besides, tormenting them will entertain me, and I suppose it will make for an amusing Monday night, don't you think? Wilson said, to which the devil did not respond. I assume you dislike that boy for he is the reason your favorite witch died. Wilson snarkily remarked, eyeing the mist of blackness coyly. You are right about one thing, Wilson Stevenson too. She was my only and favorite witch. I loved her and betrayed her, all those years ago, the devil said in a growling voice. I do not know the whereabouts of this boy, for the witch has marked him, not I. When I find him, I shall punish him just like I did the witch, for the trouble they caused. Knowingly or not, I do not care. Wilson widened his eyes at this comment. So the all-knowing devil does not know Yuta is in this school building right now. Wilson's parted lips slowly upturned into a grin at this revelation. Have you taken the witch somewhere? Or has death done its duty? Mayhaps you know where she is even if death had taken her. What is the witch's name, by the way? He hastily asked, eager to change the topic so the devil would not inquire about Yuta. The devil did not respond. Instead, he stared at Wilson blankly, and Wilson wondered if he was the devil's least favorite Stevenson from the way he responded to him. No matter, it is his loss for refusing to get to know my wonderful self. Wilson shrugged and continued to converse with the devil. I have a clearer understanding of my mission now. I must kill my marked students and force a mark upon Yuta after finding him, wherever he is. Then I will persuade him into choosing the first option. All is well, devil. All is not well, Wilson Stevenson too. You will understand soon. Wilson Stevenson causally strolled through the cafeteria during lunch, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He scanned the cafeteria, filled with bustling and chaotic students. When his eyes landed on the circular table occupied by Olivia's squad, he grinned excitedly. He watched with observant eyes as Jessica swiftly stood up from her seat, running away from Josh and Olivia's makeout session that didn't fail to make even him grimace. Wilson hid behind a group of students as Jessica sauntered towards the girls' washroom, a milk carton in her hand. When Jessica shut the door behind her, Wilson eagerly approached the closed door. With one swift movement, he slammed his right palm on the door. Dark mist slithered down his palm and slipped through the crevices, prepared to turn into Jessica's fear at one simple touch. Wilson evilly grinned and he turned to walk away, his burning hands stuffed in his pockets. Suddenly, his vision blurred as Jessica's piercing screams erupted from within the washroom. Wilson rubbed his eyes and after a moment, the blurriness disappeared. Jessica was marked. Now, he had access to her grim mind and her fears that the paranormal activity would manifest from her true self. She's afraid of showing her true self, so she hides with makeup. Wilson widened his eyes with realization. No wonder the paranormal activity took the form of an ugly little girl that looked like her, with drooping makeup. It was what she looked like, confined to Olivia's shackles. After school, Wilson entered the pool room. He figured Carter would be here since the first swim meeting was today. Behind him, the shadow trailed after him, still wobbling on his newborn feet despite being as tall as a man. He was invisible to the human eye, so Wilson didn't have to worry about anyone seeing the idiotic lad. As he strolled through the room, Mrs. Gill waved at him and he waved back. "Is there something you need, Mr. Stevenson?" she giddily asked, approaching him with a flushed face and a high-pitched tone. "Yes, there is. Would you mind showing me where the equipment room is?" "There's something I need," Wilson kindly requested, nodding. "Do all the women here have a fling for me? Why do they think I like them because I act nice?" "I simply do that to trick my students," he scoffed to himself. Mrs. Gill eagerly bobbed her head. "Follow me," she exclaimed, trotting towards the equipment room. She unlocked the door and allowed Wilson in. "If there's anything else you need, I'd be more than happy to help," she said, returning to her supervising position. Wilson forcibly smiled at her and stepped inside the dimly lit room. He silently shut the door and left a portion of it open for later. He pressed his ears against the right wall and was able to overhear the conversations occurring in the change room next to the equipment room, with a quick snap of his powerful fingers. "Are all American schools like this place?" Wilson heard Yuta ask. "Yuta?" Wilson exclaimed to the shadow that copied his position against the wall. "So he is here too. Perhaps I can attempt to mark him right now. Oh, how splendid would my day be if I succeed," he whispered to the shadow, who eagerly nodded from beside him. "What do you mean?" he heard Carter ask in response. "I mean, this place is kind of gloomy. Plus the school building gives off a dark atmosphere. From the outside at least," Yuta explained. "Willesden is really old. I heard this place was built in the 15th century or something." "You'll get used to it," Carter answered. Wilson scoffed with knowingness. "Damn right. This school is older than me," he told the silent and observant shadow. He heard the light footsteps of the boys walking towards the door, so he acted before they opened the door. He discreetly outstretched his arms through the ajar door and slashed the air, directing the dark mist that pooled from him towards the boys. "I can do it 2 at a time. This will work," he proudly hissed to the shadow. Wilson swiftly recoiled to his safe hiding spot and shut his eyes, waiting for the paranormal activity to touch them. To his shock, as his vision blurred and he observed what was happening within the room, the shadow swirled around Yuta, not even landing a touch on him. Instead, it swerved and possessed Carter, rendering him unable to unlock the change room door. "Maybe it's busted. It just needs a little push," Wilson heard Carter desperately grunt. "Damn it," Wilson exclaimed from within the equipment room. Wilson rubbed his temples with frustration as he slumped against the wall. "That boy is going to be tricky." The shadow copied Wilson's slumped position and tried to open his mouth to form words, but nothing came out. Wilson rubbed his eyes again and sighed as Carter's pool of thoughts swarmed his. He was officially marked now and his mind was a jumbled mess, flooded with strict rules and such. Wilson suddenly jerked his head up as Carter's core fear flooded his senses. Distance. He's afraid of drifting away from Yuta. Wilson furrowed his eyebrows with bewilderment. But they just met. He wondered out loud. After moments of pondering, he decided to leave it at the fact that humans were tricky beings, especially their incomprehensible brains. "Perhaps it is a good thing," Wilson said to the shadow as they walked out of the equipment room before his powers wore off. "Since Carter fears of drifting away from Yuta, that means he will be sticking to his side. Which means I get more attempts at marking that damn witch. Though of course I will not allow Carter to walk away with that boy and live happily ever after," he said, as he waved goodbye to Mrs. Gill. "That boy is mine." Wilson silently stood in front of Mrs. Briggs' science class, waiting for the perfect moment. He glanced over at the shadow standing beside him, who had matured somewhat through the night. "Thank you, Shadow, for finding Olivia for me," he muttered to the shadow, who jumped up and down like a dog at his praise. He pressed his ears against the door, and with a snap of his fingers, he overheard the commotion going on inside. "It looks like to me that you're scribbling absolutely nothing into your notebook. See, what does this look like to you?" Mrs. Briggs curtly pointed out, scolding Olivia. "That which looks like you," Olivia replied smugly. The entire class laughed and Wilson could sense the fury that emitted from Mrs. Briggs. He turned to the shadow and quietly chuckled. "She is not wrong at all. That woman acts more like a witch than the witch. That's it. Go inside the closet and reflect on your disrespectful actions," Mrs. Briggs ordered. After she purposely prolonged pushing out her chair and standing up, Olivia entered the detention closest. Wilson nodded towards the shadow. "This is our chance," he said, pushing the door to the classroom open. "Mrs. Briggs," he excitedly exclaimed, entering the classroom with outstretched arms. All the students jumped up with surprise, and a look of relief washed over their faces as their favorite teacher was an angel next to Mrs. Briggs. "Oh my, Mr. Stevenson. What a pleasant surprise," she exclaimed as she dropped her textbook and hurriedly rushed towards Wilson. Wilson nodded and beamed at her, although from the corner of his eye, he noticed Yuta sitting in the back of the classroom. "He is here." Wilson turned to grin at the shadow, who shook his head furiously. "The shadow is right. Marking the boy in broad daylight will raise suspicions. For now I will focus on Olivia. Mrs. Briggs, I need your help with that paperwork the teachers were assigned. I know you are quite the intelligent lady, so I purposely sought you," Wilson said, flashing Mrs. Briggs a wink that was noticed by every student. "I hope I'm not disturbing your class." "Not at all," Mrs. Briggs swiftly exclaimed, adjusting her glasses and flailing her hands in the air, flustered by the wink. "Come to my desk, Mr. Stevenson." Her desk was at the front of the classroom, next to the detention closet. As Wilson leaned forward and peered down at the papers Mrs. Briggs was holding, he folded his hands behind his back. He momentarily looked up and eyed Yuta, who was absent-mindedly scribbling notes. Wilson silently sprawled his right palm against the shut door of the detention closet, and the shadow crouched to peer at the dark mist that slithered through the crevices of the door. He shot Wilson a thumbs up, to which Wilson beamed at. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Briggs," Wilson happily exclaimed, placing his burning right palm on her shoulder. Mrs. Briggs jumped up with surprise at the sudden body contact and looked up at Wilson with a red face. "Anytime," she squeaked, her thunderous voice from before long gone. Wilson nodded and walked around her desk, shooting her another wink. "I'll see you in the teacher's lounge," he said as he walked by Yuta's desk. "Oh, of course," she replied happily. Before Wilson left the room, he heard her order Yuta to grab a microscope from the closet. "While you're at it, tell Olivia she can come out and talk to me." Wilson smirked as he shut the classroom door behind him, just as Yuta opened the detention closet door. From the moment his powers marked Olivia, he learned the turmoil and wreck that was her brain and her surprising fears. Unknown. She lives her life constantly in the dark about things, such as Jessica's hatred. So she's afraid of the unknown because of how her parents' divorce was suddenly sprung onto her, plus a certain horrific event from her past. Wilson sighed with satisfaction as he learned about Olivia's life troubles. He knew she was going to be quite entertaining to torment. That same day after school, Wilson followed the shadow, who was much swifter than he was. He knew the shadow enjoyed being faster, and Wilson slammed the back of his neck with his fist. "Stop smirking. You should have seen me in my youth. I was the fastest runner among my peers." He huffed as he placed his hands on his knees when the shadow halted in his tracks. Wilson was still catching his breath as they stood in the middle of the grim field when the shadow pointed straight ahead. He looked towards where the shadow was pointing and grinned. Wilson stood up and wrapped his arm around the shadow's misty shoulder. "You are a lot more useful than I had initially thought," Wilson said, to which the shadow clapped his hands ecstatically. "Now it's Josh's turn to be marked." Wilson waved his right hand in the air and shot his powers towards Josh at lightning speed. When the dark mist that ejected from his palm landed on Josh, who was chucking a football on the field, his vision blurred and Wilson knew that he had successfully marked the boy. "Marking them is always the easiest part," Wilson proudly informed the shadow. "Likewise, finally killing them is the most amusing part of all," he said, grinning as he walked away with the knowledge of his fourth marked person. Disappointment. He's afraid of disappointing his mothers. "What a wimp, for someone so dedicated to football," Wilson remarked to the shadow, shaking his head. Wilson kept a watchful eye on Ronald throughout the rest of the football practice. But there was never the perfect moment. The perfect moment always came with the impulse. The devil's impulse, his mother called it. By the time the boy left the building, Willesden grunted with frustration. The shadow poked him teasingly as if to say, "Marking them is always the easiest part, remember?" "Yes, it is. Except for Yuta. Yuta is the only exception because I can't seem to get through that damn witch boy," he yelled as he stomped after Ronald at a safe distance away. Willesden paused in his tracks when Ronald approached Jessica, who had been sitting on the benches. He gritted his teeth as they walked away, and raised his fist in the air. "If the devil is not going to tell me, I will do it myself. I cannot risk him walking off school property, or else I have to wait until tomorrow to mark him," he shouted to the shadow, who was laughing at Willesden's frustration. Suddenly, as if it were a gift from the devil, the mark on his right palm burned as Ronald stopped in his tracks to hug Jessica. The impulse. "Finally, you wretched devil," he thought, as he slashed the air excitedly. Willesden sighed with relief as Ronald's body froze, and visions erupted within his mind. "See what I told you," Willesden said, turning to grin at the dumbfounded shadow. "Easy." His head swirled and his vision blurred as the fifth marked person entered his head of swarming kids. This time, his vision blurred for much longer as his aged soul took in the excessive amounts of new information. Second place. He's afraid of being second place, so he's scared of Josh. Willesden tilted his head skyward and laughed out loud, in the middle of the school courtyard. His laugh was malevolent and maniacal, so the shadow was grateful that Jessica and Ronald were long gone by then. These stupid kids and their stupid fears. Oh, how easy it will be to kill them off. Are you listening, Shadow? They are so stupid, they will never realize that what's happening to them is not a dream. About a week later, Willesden had successfully marked his first 5 students and tormented Carter and Olivia a second time. However, he had not yet found the right time to mark his 6th and final student, Barbara. Something more crucial and dire took his attention away from that. The after-school meeting. He had never would have fathomed the idea of his 6 marked students combining forces. They were all simply so different from each other that there was no way they could last in the same room for less than a minute. It happened a couple of days before, and Willesden was glad he was in the right place at the right time, or else those damn kids would have figured out too much. Are they idiotic? Are they stupid? The answer is yes, they are. Willesden ranted to the shadow, who trudged beside him as they walked through the halls during lunchtime. Did they truly think grouping together would solve the mystery? The answer is, of course not. They will get absolutely nowhere because they are idiotic and stupid. He fumed, waving his arms expressively. Suddenly, the shadow grabbed Willesden by the shoulders and shoved him into room 110, a classroom they happened to walk by. What the hell was that for? Willesden screeched, but the shadow covered his mouth with his dark palms. The shadow slowly creaked the door a couple of inches open and pointed at the girl who had just turned the corner. Willesden peered at the girl as she approached the hallway they were in, and widened his eyes. "Barbara," he muttered with parted lips. Slowly, Willesden grinned and without a moment's hesitation, he snapped his fingers. Within the classroom, a pool of darkness spawned out of thin air and slithered towards the chubby girl who now sat on the floor next to the classroom. The pool of darkness silently touched the girl and retreated to Willesden at his guide. Willesden kneeled on the floor and stroked the darkness that was slowly turning into a spider. "Good boy," he murmured, failing to notice the shadow's jealousy at the affection the thing was receiving. As each second ticked by, the tiny spider increased in size. The spider that was situated next to the door, so every time it increased, the door would move an inch open. Then it creaked a couple more inches open. Then it creaked halfway open. Finally, it creaked all the way open, and with a wave of his hand, the spider burst through the doorway and lunged at Barbara, who was previously eating her sandwich peacefully. She screamed and was slammed to the floor by the abnormal spider. Willesden shut the door and leaned against it, out of breath. Perhaps I am getting old, he thought, clutching his nauseous stomach. Or perhaps it is the 6 marked students' souls I have swirling in my mind that's making me winded. Barbara was officially marked. The last to be marked, due to some unforeseen circumstances Willesden still had to solve. He paused to take a deep breath before fully submerging himself within Barbara's befuddling mind. Olivia. She's afraid of Olivia and views her as a big monster that can kill her. Willesden rolled his eyes and shook his head. I regret expecting more from that stupid girl, he said to the shadow. However, the shadow wasn't listening. He gazed through the ajar door at the girl who was almost beaten to death and then glimpsed at the man beside him, preoccupied with his own worries. Did it sadden or pain Wilson Stevenson one bit that he was tormenting these innocent children? The shadow did not have to think twice. The answer is not at all. 238 Wilson Basketball. Surprisingly, Wilson did not regret proposing that idea. It not only showed the kids his fabricated devotion towards the leadership club, but it also allowed for an opportunity to sneakily mark Yuta. Although by now he learned it wasn't going to be an easy task. Josh, I will not condone shoving to occur on school property, he sternly yelled from the sidelines. Yuta laughed at Josh's flustered expression and smiled at Mr. Stevenson, who tipped his red cap towards him. When Yuta turned his back on him and resumed playing the game, Wilson bit his lips. I have to find a way. Jessica cheerfully clapped her hands, snapping Wilson out of his pool of befuddling thoughts. You can do it, Yuta. Pass to me, she exclaimed, waving to Yuta from across the court. That's the spirit, Jessica. Mr. Stevenson set a look of amusement on his face as he watched his students attempt to work together as a team. Learn something from her, Josh. Wilson rubbed the temples of his forehead as Yuta clumsily chucked the ball at Jessica. Why did that damn girl speak? Now I can't get out of her whiny head. It took a couple of minutes for the traumatizing memories the girl had of her mother killing her father in front of her eyes to wash away. It was puzzling at first, swimming through 6 teenagers' minds. Wilson had a lot of trouble maneuvering through his first set of marked students in 1846, but by now he knew all the tricks. However, no matter how practiced he was, it would always drain his energy. Even his scatterbrained pet shadow hovering beside him could tell Wilson was on the brink of losing control. All right, Carter. Jimmy ecstatically cheered as Carter dove to retrieve the ball from Jessica. Carter grinned and puffed his chest proudly. He stuck his tongue out at Josh, his teammate. That's why I have a silver medal. He gloated triumphantly. Yuta rushed towards Carter and stood in front of him, his eyes wide with ambrosial and his tender lips pouting cutely. Carter, can I have the ball? He softly requested, outstretching his hands. Carter blinked rapidly and a blush appeared on his cheeks. Okay, he said after barely a moment of hesitation. Wilson placed his palm over his mouth to stop from laughing out loud. Even if he had not swum through Carter's head for a day, he still would have guessed that the boy had an attraction towards Yuta. Anyone could have guessed that if they weren't simple-minded teenagers like the bunch in front of him. Wilson was still unsure of how he felt about Carter's distasteful attraction towards Yuta and Josh having 2 mothers. He couldn't decide between feeling sickened or creating a laughingstock out of them. Perhaps a mixture of both would ease his mind. Carter gently handed the ball to Yuta, violating so many rules in 1 second. Wilson sensed Josh's blood boiling at this gesture through a quick dip in his mind. Josh lunged forward and grabbed Carter's hair. He started pulling at it furiously, adding a few punches here and there. You idiot! You bastard! You mother! Mr. Stevenson sternly blew his whistle before Josh could finish. Josh, I will not condone cussing to occur on school property. Ronald slapped Yuta's back, impressed with the boy's cunning tactic. Good job, Yuta, he said, laughing at Josh's demise. Wilson smirked at this exchange. Good. Congratulate each other. Bond with each other. Savor these precious moments. For I will soon grab you each by the throat and force you to watch your other marked friends dying by my right hand. Subconsciously, Wilson gulped as that thought echoed through his brain. He wasn't sure whether that was a gulp of nervousness since his head was flooded with so many strangling thoughts. He could barely register his own. He decided to play it off as a simple gulp. Nothing more, nothing less. Beside him, the shadow peered at Wilson with confusion. On the other side of the court, Olivia stood with her arms crossed, refusing to play. She walked aimlessly around the court and looked down at the ground. Wilson casually spun his head and noticed her lack of participation. Olivia, show some enthusiasm, he called, though his enthusiasm was a facade. Olivia shot her teacher a scornful glare. What do you want me to do? Jazz hands, she said, mockingly splaying her fingers and waving them in the air. Wilson chuckled in response, only to narrow his eyes and smirk when she turned away. Poor Olivia, he sarcastically murmured underneath his breath to the shadow. What a pity it was to paralyze her with my powers, so she couldn't break free from her therapist's grasp the other day. He returned his gaze at the group of students who were running around the court, wearing radiant smiles. Their energy spilled out as fun was printed in their DNA. All it took was a basketball game and a dash of happiness to bring that out. Was Mr. Stevenson having fun too? No, never. Wilson abruptly blew his silver whistle and called for the entire group. Folks, I want to see more cooperation and teamwork. He said to the gathering that surrounded him. Talk to each other, discuss strategies, and pass the ball to your teammates, he instructed, emphasizing every word. I'm looking at you, Josh. Carter tauntingly laughed in Josh's face. Mr. Stevenson, you're right. I think you should disqualify him. Josh clapped his hands together and looked up at Mr. Stevenson with his shining green eyes that were young. So young. Too young. Don't disqualify me, Mr. Stevenson. I promise I'll be a better team player, he pleaded, his words genuine. Wilson gulped again as he stared down at the pleading boy. When he realized he was staring at him for a second too long, he frantically shook his head and forcibly chuckled. What is wrong with me today? Focus on your mission, Wilson. Focus. Of course not, Josh. Disqualifying you would be unfair. Plus, you remind me of my high school basketball years. However, I am going to have to teach you all about sportsmanship and how that ties in with leadership, all right? He said, pointing at the board behind him. First, I want you to remember that the opposite team is not your enemy. They are simply hurdles you must jump over. He enthusiastically began, blinking away the strange emotions swirling through him. After his pep talk, Mr. Stevenson blew his whistle again, signaling a new game. Let's do it right this time. He shouted as everyone stood in their positions and prepared for the first real round. Mr. Stevenson threw the ball in the air, and Yuta swiftly jumped to grab it. Too slow, Carter. Yuta excitedly shouted, dribbling past him. Damn you. Carter grunted. He attempted to catch Yuta off guard by grabbing the ball from his left side, but Yuta swiftly blocked him by pivoting to the right and raising an arm. Over here, Yuta. Jessica's jolly voice shouted. Yuta grinned and tossed the ball to her as he sprinted across the court. Wilson stared at them with slightly parted lips. His lips weren't parted with fury or shock. They were parted with excitement. His wide eyes trailed after Yuta as he dribbled down the court, blocking Carter from his path. Then his eyes flashed towards Jessica as she swerved around the motionless Olivia. His head followed alongside the rest of his numb body as the ball went to Barbara and she sped past Jimmy. Then Ronald caught the ball and fought against Josh for it. He successfully passed his hurdle and landed a slam dunk for Team B. Wilson could not resist the urge to cheer alongside the students. He told himself that this was part of his act, that this was simply an impulse. Ronald! 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 Yuta and the rest of Team B cheered, jumping in the air and hugging Ronald. Ronald laughed and embraced his team, all wearing elated smiles. It was a day they would cherish forever. Wilson could sense from simply a graze of his fingertips against each of their souls. Now that's what I call excellent teamwork and spirit. Wilson cheered, waving his red cap excitedly in the air. Before Wilson rushed towards the kids to give them ecstatic high fives, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and widened his eyes at the sight of the shadow's confused face. It was as if he was asking, "Why are you so happy?" Wilson gulped nervously. Thick and strange emotions swirled within him as his heart surprisingly grew heavy. "Why am I so happy?" he asked himself as he furrowed his eyebrows and clenched his fists. "Why am I so happy?" he thought as he spun to face the 4 cheering students and the 4 sulking students. "Why?" Wilson thought as he squinted to peer at Yuta's beaming eyes and shining smile. "At least you folks in Team A tried your best. I saw how fired up you all were. That's the kind of energy we need here at Willesden," Wilson encouragingly said a couple of minutes later while rubbing Josh's hunched back. "Mr. Stevenson, we did great too, right?" Yuta asked as he stared up at Wilson with an innocent look. "So innocent. Too innocent." Wilson grinned, and although it was forced, it was not to conceal his secret hatred towards them. It was to conceal the pain beneath the mask he wore. "Of course. Team A did wonderfully. It's not about the fact that you won, it's about how well you worked together," he earnestly replied, ruffling Yuta's head affectionately. Utah merrily laughed and bobbed his head, like a child enjoying his father's loving embrace. Minutes before the lunch bell rang, Wilson applauded them and allowed them to leave, after a quick pep talk of course. Wilson walked across the court to pack his belongings, his gaze cast on the floor as he sensed the group of children huddling behind him. He knew they were talking about the paranormal mystery they were attempting to solve. Wilson plopped onto the wooden bleachers and kept his eyes on his gym bag as he piled his belongings into it. The shadow sat beside him, and after minutes of prolonged staring, Wilson had enough and snapped at him. "What the hell are you looking at, Shadow?" he snapped, turning to look up at the shadow that sat on his right. The shadow parted his lips, trying to speak, but he couldn't because he was Wilson's idiotic pet. Wilson sighed and rubbed the temples of his forehead as slight guilt pulsed through him because of the shadow's hurt expression. "Listen, I'm sorry," he muttered, embarrassed that he was apologizing to a being he created himself and that no human could see. "I'm just tired. I know I told you I was going to try and mark Utah today, but I never found the perfect time. There were too many of those stupid kids, running around with their gleeful faces." Wilson slumped in his seat as he glanced at the kids huddled in the middle of the court. "Look at those stupid kids. They're being so obvious. I can't believe they genuinely think I have no clue about the schemes and shenanigans they perform during their after-school meetings," Wilson remarked, shaking his head with disdain. "I'm glad that I purposely made those test results confusing because now they're back to square one," he added, sniggering triumphantly to himself. The shadow shuffled closer towards Wilson as if he wanted to say something. Wilson glimpsed at the shadow's face, and it appeared to be contorted with concern and pity. "Why the hell are you looking at me like that?" Wilson remarked, snapping his fingers in front of his face, to which the shadow did not flinch. "Is it because I failed to kill those kids and mark Utah?" "Listen, Shadow. You're new so you don't understand how things work with Wilson Stevenson," he said, crossing his arms gruffly. "I enjoy tormenting my mark students for a couple of months before killing them. As for Utah, he's a tricky one, I'll admit. The dark mist that pours from my palm is not sufficient enough to mark him, so I am planning to resort to some other method. Perhaps I will forcibly carve the mark upon Utah, just as the witch did to me 100 years ago." To Wilson's shock, his crossed arms had a tremor. He raised his eyebrows, confused at his body that seemed to be acting on its own. Wilson slowly uncrossed his arms and realized that it was his hands that were quivering. "Why am I shaking? There is nothing to be scared about," he wondered, gulping nervously as the swirling emotions within him spun faster than a hurricane. The shadow placed his misty hand upon Wilson's shaking wrist, with a knowing look written on his featureless face. "W. Wilson Stevenson." The shadow sputtered, trembling with his words simply because he was Wilson's idiotic pet. "We were scared. Scared to kill them and scared to mark him, are you not?" Wilson's eyes shot open and he gasped with disbelief. "What? No. How dare those be your first words, you foolish shadow?" The shadow shrugged, unable to continue speaking. They stared at each other for a moment, and Wilson realized that there was no use hiding from the shadow because he was the one who created the shadow. He was a piece of him, I suppose. "There is some truth to your statement, Shadow," Wilson admitted softly. "Recently there has been a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. I do not know what it is, but it feels as if I'm swimming and I want to put my feet down on something solid. But the water is deeper than I thought and there's nothing there. That's what I'm feeling. Make what you will of it." "Scared. You are scared," the shadow simply stated. "You are a monster and monsters are scared. That's why they are monsters." Wilson was too exhausted to rebuttal his comment. Instead, he sighed and timidly nodded. "Perhaps I am scared, I do not know. Perhaps I am scared to kill those young children. Perhaps I am scared to make that innocent boy suffer. Although what I do know for a fact is that I have not listened to my advice. I went down this road 100 years ago, and I told myself it's best not to get attached to them. I promised that to make it easier for myself. However, I suppose I have gotten attached to them. I do not know how or why, but I have. If anything, I blame those leadership meetings and their secret after-school meetings that I have eavesdropped on. Those stupid folks made me soft with their childish banter," Wilson said, scrunching his face as the difficult words poured from his mouth. "I've known 7 of them for 2 years, and although those 2 years are nothing compared to the decades that I have lived without them, it still scares me. It still makes my heart wrench with remorse. Remorse for tormenting them when they are so young, vibrant, free, and innocent. Remorse for knowing their doomed fate and being the one causing it instead of ending it. He pointed at the 8 students discussing and debating with each other in the middle of the court. Look at those stupid kids. Did you see them today, trotting around with a ball in their hands? As if this was the best day they had ever lived. Their faces were stupidly happy, they are stupidly young, their problems are stupidly naive compared to mine. They are just so stupid that I cannot bring myself to slap them with reality. He paused to gulp nervously, unsure of how to describe his feelings. They are so stupid that sometimes I feel like the act I put on in front of them is genuine at times. Somewhere deep inside the depths of my soul, I can't help but wonder whether the kind and encouraging words I say to them are truthful. That's how stupid those kids are, for making me feel that way. I hate this feeling, and I hate how I realize this while watching those stupid kids play a stupid sport. Willesden gritted his teeth and sighed as he gazed at Utah. The boy was so absent-minded, so naive, and so devoted to his friends, that it pained Willesden to look at him. He always sought to improve rather than demolish, and it reminded him of the witch. Staring at the boy's silky obsidian hair and piercing black eyes also reminded him of the suffering that he was going to have to place upon that boy. And Willesden knew very well that Utah did not deserve any of it. What I'm trying to say is it worth it? Is it worth betraying those innocent children for my freedom, even if that freedom is death? The shadow shifted beside him and a question he had been wanting to ask tumbled out of his mouth. Do you feel at least one bit of guilt, Willesden Stevenson? Every man is guilty of all the good he did not do, Shadow. Willesden hastily stood up from his seat and slung his red gym bag over his shoulder. He grudgingly trudged towards the students with a sullen gaze, leaving the shadow to solemnly trail after him. When he approached them, he forced a smile. What exactly are we going to do? Carter asked the group. Jimmy smirked, eyeing his friends with a smug expression. Study some books in the library. I'm sure there will be some hints about Willesden's history. The library. I see you kiddos are scholars too. That's excellent. Willesden needs well-rounded and balanced leaders, Willesden said proudly, using his words to hide his wavering emotions. Well, I'll see you folks after school. He exclaimed brightly. Mr. Stevenson, we already did a lot of leadership activities. Is it possible to not have a meeting today? Utah hopefully asked, peering up at him with kind eyes. Willesden Stevenson laughed and gently shook his head, his heart pounding guiltily as he gazed at the group that admired him so much. Too much. You lot are Willesden's first leaders, and there's still a lot of training I must put you through. Don't worry, there is loads of time for us to progress. I can't wait to see how this year unfolds. The library, huh? Willesden muttered to the shadow, as they walked towards the vacant school library of Willesden. They will find nothing in the library, he said, as he unbuttoned the beige satchel that was slung around his waist. He pushed open the wooden doors of the school library, which was surprisingly the only remnant of the Church of Willesden, as he recalled his mother telling him. The library had been somewhat renovated over the past century, but the eerie atmosphere remained from millennia past. Dust collected everywhere as far as he could see, and spider webs wove loosely around books, dirted shelves and stands. Overhead, busted lamps hung from the cracked ceiling that was embedded with braided wires. The ground was littered with dirt, books, and torn paper, which was something Willesden saw often at Willesden. The crevices in the wall allowed small slivers of light to spill inside since the windows were tinted with gray. They will find nothing of use in this library, Willesden told the shadow after he scanned the library and deemed it empty of students. Except for perhaps a book strictly about the witch trials, which has little information about the paranormal activity. Fortunately, the curse will not be mentioned, despite the witch trails truly being the context of the curse, Willesden explained to the dumbfounded shadow. Willesden outstretched his arms as the dim sunlight shone through the dust-covered library. It's amazing how little the human historians know about the past, Willesden remarked, smirking at the shadow. He sauntered towards a bookshelf on the left side of the library and stood in front of the array of books. The inky treasures were slumped against each other with gentle seaside hues, soft blues, grays, and browns. The wooden bookcase was ornate as if carved by a person with a profound love of literature. The engravings were of roses, ravens, crows, and bats. One would have gasped at the realization that this room was once part of a church. However, the engravings were in such a sublime manner that it looked as if a saint had created it himself. Wilson glanced behind his shoulder at the shadow, whose flickering eyes stared at the books with awe. Wilson chuckled at that expression. "Those books are ordinary, Shadow. They are nothing compared to this treasure." Wilson pulled a thick book from out of his beige satchel and held it up to the light for all to see. The book's spine croaked, and he knew that if he pressed too hard it would crumble in his hands, like a decaying flower. The edges of the black cover were frayed, causing the bristles to pinch at his skin. The cover itself was unremarkable, as it was an ominous black color with the title printed in a darker shade. Pars de Malleus Maleficarum, the title read. Imprinted on its very last page was the devil's mark that had appeared the day the pact had officially begun, on September 3, 1246. The creased pages within were thinner than air and yellowed with age, as it had gone through centuries of current. The stories inside were written for the Stevensons, although some parts were hampered and messed up sometime during the late 1800s. Wilson remembered clamoring to retrieve the stolen book from the hands of some government official of Willesden. When the book returned to him in his mother's hands, some of the pages had been rewritten, with basic information about how Willesden was built upon a church and such. Thankfully, the stories his mother had written had not been hampered with. Although it was not like there was any use of it anymore, since Wilson would not be receiving a newborn of his own blood. He recalled wondering where the book had come from, and how his mother got her hands on it. As a teen he asked his mother this. She responded with a simple shrug and said in 1246, "I foresaw a man named Heinrich Kramer who would write a book in 1486 about the heresy of modern witchcraft. So I took a piece of that book, hence the name Parsda, and erased all the misleading information as early as I could. Unfortunately, I could not retrieve the remaining portion of the book that had yet to be written, so that book went on to influence the witch purges even more so." Wilson stuffed the book within the shelves and stuck it out forward, so it would be noticed by the kids when they searched the library for a clue. Wyson stepped backward and sighed satisfactorily as he stared at the Pars de Malleus Maleficarum. The black book eyed him knowingly as it held all the knowledge the witch had. "You must be wondering, Shadow. Why did I suddenly choose to help the kids when less than a day ago I was angry that they were attempting to solve the so-called mystery?" Wilson said, studying the black book that poked out of the sea of colorful inky treasures. "Well, it is because I have sabotaged them so much that I've hindered their progress," he explained, his heavy heart from before long gone. "I shall give them a hint, so they can conclude themselves what exactly the paranormal activity is. I want this to be over as fast as possible and I am desperate to complete my mission. I can no longer wait." The shadow turned to stare at Wilson, befuddled. "Why, you said you were guilty about this," he pointed out. Wilson nodded, his lips curving into a playful smirk. "Of course I am. But I never said I wasn't going to do it. I had my doubts, but now I realize death does not discriminate or judge. Whatever option Yuta chooses, I will die without a second thought. And that is something worth killing a couple of kids for, no matter how attached I am towards them." "Why, you are not the least bit scared, Wilson Stevenson." "I am very scared, Shadow. But everyone has to overcome their fears at some point, right?